During the war in Vietnam, I took a bullet through the chest. I can't really describe what it was to have the spinal cord severed and both lungs collapse. All I can tell you is that I live my life very aware that it's a gift and this is borrowed time. When you realize how finite life is, you find its meaning in something beyond yourself. As part of reconciliation from the Vietnam War, I went back to Indochina. The landmine campaign began when we realized that there were more landmines in Cambodia than there were people. So many of these landmine victims were civilians. If you've seen injustice and you've been touched by injustice, it's the passion and the commitment to do something about it that really is the engine that drives change.
This is Glenn Close. Speak truth to power. Help rid the world of landmines.
I heard a man's voice. Hello, my love. We have some things to discuss. Every part of my body froze with fear. I was driven to a clandestine prison, falsely accused of being a subversive, and then interrogated, tortured, and repeatedly raped. When I returned to the United States, I spoke about the American who my torturers referred to as their boss. I pressured the Guatemalan and U.S. governments to release information about my case. I did what I thought any human being would do, and that was to speak the truth.
This is Glenn Close. Speak truth to power. Demand that all governments respect human rights.
They arrested me. They tortured me brutally for 3 days. Some of my friends have been shot and killed. I collect stories in the jungles of Burma. I've walked thousands of miles, and I've heard so many stories of killing, rape.
The Burmese military works on behalf of corporations.
Anytime that corporation want to do something on the land of the people, the military force the villagers to leave the village and they burn down all the houses. So we sued the corporation. When you see those people, I mean, your heart is truly broken. You want to do anything that you could do to help.
This is Glenn Close. Speak truth to power. Demand that corporations around the world respect human rights.
I was labeled as a counter-revolutionary and sentenced to life under forced labor. They said my political attitude was a problem. But there's no paper, no trial. The police just simply come to the school, took me away. I gave 19 years of my life. I came to the United States. I want to stay away from politics. But the nightmare from the labor camps never let me go. I want people to be aware of what life is like under forced labor. We have to tell the truth. It is about human rights.
This is Glenn Close. Speak truth to power. Join the fight for human rights in China.
I didn't know anything about the death penalty. Wrote to a man on death row and ended up walking with him to the electric chair, and I watched as they killed him. You're either paralyzed by what you see or you're galvanized by it. And when I walked out of that execution chamber, I knew I absolutely had to do something. My job then was to start telling the story. If you look at who's targeted for death row, it's poor people. And people of color are more likely to be executed. This is a profound act of despair. The only thing we know to do is to say whoever did this deserves to die. But the deeper moral question for us as a society has got to be to ask, but do we deserve to kill them?
This is Glenn Close. Speak truth to power. Call for a moratorium on capital punishment.
They had endured months of misery for a new life in America, for freedom in the promised land.
These people risked their lives to get here.
But once their ship ran aground, they were hauled off to prison.
What happened to these people when they were put on my soil, my country's soil? They were treated like animals.
Why were they forced to endure such hardships? And today, as the government considers letting millions of other illegal immigrants become legal residents, why are so many who come to the United States seeking freedom locked up instead?
What we are looking at is our law enforcement concerns
But has the government gone too far?
We're going to look back on this period and we're going to be ashamed of ourselves.
Tonight, a Tom Brokaw Hour.
Are there many who come here for all the reasons that America stands for, who simply fall through the cracks?
The Promised Land, a Dateline special, reported by Tom Brokaw.
Whoever you are, chances are someone in your family came to America from somewhere else, perhaps arriving in these very waters, their eyes fixed on the Statue of Liberty. Part of its inscription reads, "Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me." But not too long ago, some tempest-tossed men and women arrived here and found little of that gentle welcome. In fact, although they were not charged with any crime, they were sent to prison. And today, thousands of others who've come to the United States seeking refuge are locked up as well. It's a little-known story that raises some disturbing questions about immigration policy in this country. And it may raise a question for you. What if your relatives had been treated this way when they first arrived here? They had traveled 18,000 miles in cramped, squalid quarters.
It was dark, damp, just plain filthy.
A 4-month voyage, unbearable, but for the hope of a new life in a promised land.
These people risked their lives to get here.
But now it was all ending in chaos. 280 of them shipwrecked. Ironically, just around the bend from the Statue of Liberty. The story of so many, so desperate to reach America, made headlines across the nation. But another, lesser-known story began that night as well. The story of an unlikely group of Americans who came to their aid and who fought to expose U.S. immigration policies they say are inconsistent, even contradictory. Policies that fail to meet the American standards of fair play. The drama unfolded on June 6, 1993, just before 2 in the morning. Park police officers David Soma and Steve DeVivier were the first of more than 300 rescuers called to Gateway National Park in Queens. What was your first clue that something was going on out there?
We saw 2 men waving and flagging us down.
Then we started hearing these screams.
These blood-curdling screams.
We and him looked at each other, and they said, we wonder, what the hell we got here?
When the officers looked into the water, they discovered a rusty freighter, the Golden Venture, wedged onto a sandbar, and a stream of Chinese immigrants plunging into the water and paddling for shore. Before long, police officers, firefighters, and Coast Guard officials were on the scene, working together to drag the desperate men and women out of the chilly 53-degree water.
I grabbed the first guy, and I couldn't figure out why he's so heavy. And I realized I'm pulling 3 people in at the same time. They tied themselves together.
But even as the officers pulled some to safety, others were making the 25-foot leap into the surf. And before long, there were dozens of Chinese bobbing in the water, hundreds more on deck, waiting for a chance to jump.
We're here trying to explain to them, stay, you know.
But they kept coming off the boat.
Yeah.
They kept jumping in.
Yeah, they wanted desperately off that boat.
But they had no life rafts.
No life rafts, nothing other than just to swim.
But not all of the passengers knew how to do that. And before the night was over, 10 were dead, succumbing to the waves or hypothermia.
After seeing so many that we were able to save, we started pulling in ones that didn't make it. That was hard.
The exodus into the water may have baffled the rescuers, but for passenger Pin Lin, the choice seemed to be obvious. Stay on the ship and face a likely return to China, or make it to shore and win a chance at freedom.
The water was bitter cold, but everyone thought they had to land on the shore, so they didn't care about the danger.
As the survivors huddled on the beach, a portrait of their dreadful journey began to emerge. How Pin Lin and the other passengers had paid smugglers for the chance to escape persecution or poverty in communist China. How they had sailed through storms and choppy seas. They had endured months without running water, 300 people for a single bathroom. On good days, they were fed a cup of water and a handful of rice. On bad days, no food at all. Finally, after 112 days at sea, they had arrived. But now they had run aground, and it was all falling apart.
Many people thought they couldn't swim to the shore or were going to die.
Along the beach, there were reminders of how Pin and many others had hoped this journey would end.
I remember one person pulling out a subway map and 2 crisp $100 bills.
Can you even imagine what it must have been like for them? 2 $100 bills, a subway map, no language, and they'd been stuck in that boat for a long time.
Couldn't imagine. Could not imagine.
When you came to know more about why they came here and under the circumstances that got them here, what did you think?
Awesome. That these people risked their lives to get here. And under the deplorable conditions that they were on board. It's just unbelievable what people do to try to come to the United States.
But the journey was far from over. Although the passengers had been trying to enter the country illegally, Pin and many others mistakenly believed that touching the beach gave them the right to stay in America.
It seemed like there was a law in the United States saying that once you got to the land, you would have rights to live there.
The reality was far more complicated.
Where are you from?
The Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS, took them into custody. And for many, a new ordeal began in a place they had hoped would be a land of opportunity. Today, 8 years later, echoes of what happened to them linger all across America.
The Promised Land, a Dateline special reported by Tom Brokaw, continues.
America has often been ambivalent about immigration policy, especially during hard times. But after World War II, the United States began offering asylum, a new home, to victims of persecution abroad. So the passengers aboard the Golden Venture might have hoped they'd be welcomed. After 4 months of deprivation and one terrifying night in the waters off New York, the Golden Venture passengers had arrived in America. Many said they came for freedom, but they arrived illegally, and they landed in the center of a debate about how to stop illegal immigration.
This is not the way you come to the United States. Not you, and not the people who are going to follow you.
Retired immigration official William Slattery was in charge of INS operations on the beach that night.
It was a 3rd ship in 2 weeks. That couldn't be allowed to continue.
Let go, let go, let go.
It had been a difficult year for the Immigration Service. A terrorist posing as an asylum seeker orchestrated the World Trade Center bombing. Another would-be asylum seeker killed 2 agents at CIA headquarters. And other boats smuggling almost 1,300 Chinese immigrants were intercepted heading for the U.S. in the months before the Golden Venture arrived.
They were coming into the busiest harbors in the United States. It was like right in your face. Here we are, and you're not going to do anything to stop us.
Internal INS memos recently obtained by NBC News predicted a surge in illegal Chinese immigrants. And Clinton administration officials worried they had inherited lenient immigration policies that only encouraged more Chinese to come here looking for asylum.
You have the right to consult with the lawyer.
The U.S. government designated the situation an immigration emergency. And 2 weeks after the Golden Venture ran aground, officials launched a sweeping crackdown on the smuggling gangs.
We needed a coordinated strategy to put a halt to that type of activity. And part of that strategy meant the detention of the aliens.
They called it detention. In layman's terms, that means jail. The plan was to keep the immigrants locked up until the courts could rule on their cases, no matter how long that took. Days, weeks, or even years. Soon after the Golden Venture ran aground, the INS dispersed most of the passengers to jails and prisons all around the United States. And most of them wound up here at the York County Prison in rural Pennsylvania.
Instructed to return the Swift passport, has been here since Golden Venture.
Over time, York residents with little expertise in immigration law would battle the U.S. government in court for what they would come to consider fundamental human rights issues. One of them was paralegal Beverly Church.
Do you remember what you were thinking when you drove to the prison the first time?
Yes, I do. I was driving out in my big Cadillac at the time. I'm a Republican, and I thought, we don't need these people around here. Get them in, get them out.
Officials suspected that some passengers were making up horror stories about persecution in China. As for Church, she assumed the immigrants were criminals at worst, frauds at best. But, she says, all that changed when she met her first client.
The terror in his eyes never changed, and his story never changed, and I knew he was telling me the truth.
The truth, she says, about fleeing persecution in China to seek freedom in America.
And as she left the prison, this grandmother and former nurse, whose family had emigrated from Ireland 80 years earlier, had an epiphany that would change the course of her life and the fate of many inside the prison.
I turned and looked back, and as silly and Irish as it sounds, I could see my grandfather standing there. And I thought to myself, what if, when he came here, we did the same thing to him?
We're going to look back on this period of the 90s with the way we treated the Golden Venture detainees, and we're going to be ashamed of ourselves.
Craig Trebelcock always wanted to be a country lawyer, and for a time, that's exactly what he was.
Go! Run, 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 run!
A father and Little League coach building a practice on the outskirts of Pennsylvania's Amish country. It was a quiet life, uncomplicated. But all of that changed on June 8th, 1993, the day the Golden Venture passengers came to town.
It's taken over your life.
Absolutely.
Did you know anything at all about immigration law in America?
No, I knew absolutely nothing. I remember in law school they offered that course, and I had looked at it on the curriculum and kind of gone, who would take that? You know, what a waste.
3 weeks after the Golden Venture landed, Trebelcock, who describes himself as a political moderate, took a crash course on immigration sponsored by the local bar association.
They have a right to have everything, of course, translated. And
he thought the assignment would be brief, about 10 hours, and not very complicated. All he needed to do was to pick a client.
They passed around at the training a long list of all these names. There were over 100 of them, and there were names that are spelled like Xuexiozheng, and I was going, there's no way, I can't even pronounce that. And I went down the list and I saw one, Pin Lin, and I said, I can do that.
Pin Lin was a 28-year-old construction worker from rural China. He says he fled the country after protesting Beijing's strict family planning policies. He says his troubles began soon after his wife gave birth to their second child, a son, and officials came knocking at his door.
They're like birth control police, came to the door of the house and said, we're aware that you've had this unauthorized child. You need to pay a fine, and we're taking your wife for sterilization so you don't commit this crime again.
Pin said they tried to drag her to a birth control clinic such as this one, videotaped by a Chinese official who defected to the U.S. 3 years ago. Pin worried that his wife, still weak from labor, would die on the sterilization table. So, he says, he attacked the officials, driving them from his home.
If you saw your family treated this way, would you not confront them? We started arguing, pushing each other, and we got into a fight.
So at that point, Pin knew that his future in China was over, and he fled.
He says he hid his wife and children in a nearby village and made his way to the Golden Venture.
Pin says he paid the gangsters $3,000, 9 years of wages in China, to board the ship. He would owe them at least $20,000 more when he got to America.
What did Pin think he would find here?
Pin didn't think he'd be locked up, that's for sure.
Why would he? After all, when tales of forced sterilization and even forced late-term abortion began trickling out of China in the 1980s, U.S. leaders condemned the practice. President Ronald Reagan called it the ultimate human rights issue.
We believe population programs can and must be truly voluntary. Well, that means no coercive measures such as involuntary sterilization.
His successor, President Bush, ordered immigration officials to give birth control policies additional consideration in asylum decisions. But given the government's complicated immigration laws, once Penn came to the U.S., his asylum was anything but guaranteed. If Penn had been a Cuban, the struggle might have ended at the shore. This man was granted permission to stay in the U.S. after he was apprehended because there's a law granting residency to almost all Cubans who make it onto American soil.
But no such law exists for Chinese immigrants or any other group. So to stay in America and to get out of prison, Penland needed to convince an immigration judge that he had a well-founded fear of persecution based on his race, religion, his social group, or his political opinion.
When he first told you this story, it was all his account. You had no way of verifying it.
That's true.
Did you have any doubts about the authenticity of it?
I had all sorts of doubts about the authenticity of it.
So Trebilcock decided to test Penn's story. He says he cross-examined him, twisting facts and setting traps, tempting Penn to embellish the story to make it stronger.
His story never changed an iota. He stuck with the same story from day one, the same account.
He was animated, he was emotional, he cried.
Trebilcock's assistant, Margot Einzig, was convinced as well.
I believed every word he said, you know, and I thought that we should help him.
2 months after the Golden Venture ran aground, Trebilcock presented Penn's case in a makeshift courtroom here at the York County Prison. He said that Penn would be sterilized, jailed, or tortured if he returned to China. That Penn had a credible, well-founded fear of persecution. In short, that he was eligible for political asylum.
When you took his case before an immigration judge, did you think he had a pretty solid case?
He had a great case. When we walked out of that hearing, I was convinced we had won.
But after a number of favorable rulings to Chinese asylum seekers with stories such as Penn's, the tide had begun to turn. The outcome was hardly what Trebilcock and the other lawyers in town had expected.
We all lost. Although we're a bunch of country lawyers, we're not that bad.
The judge ruled that the flight from forced sterilization was not grounds for political asylum.
Did you have a sense of outrage?
Oh, I was totally outraged.
Trebilcock says his outrage was fueled not only by his budding friendship with Penn, but by all he had seen during a military career that took him to the Berlin Wall, where so many East Germans had perished trying to escape communism.
I believe in the values of this country of individual freedom, dignity, preservation of the rights of the individual. And so the thought that this country would take somebody that they knew was going to go back and be put into a communist prison camp, and we were going to serve him up to the Chinese government, I just couldn't believe it.
And so he appealed the decision, a move he hoped would keep Penn in the United States for a while longer. But inside the York County Prison, time would prove to be Penn's greatest ally and his worst enemy.
We now return to the Promised Land. Here again, Tom Brokaw.
The passengers of the Golden Venture who'd come to America with so much hope now found themselves in prison as if they were common criminals. And the lawyers representing them, who'd taken their cases with more than a few doubts, now found themselves caring far more than they thought they would.